After Byakuya's frankly unbelievable defeat and near-death experience at the hands of Sternritter F, the Fear Äs Nödt at the start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, I think a lot of fans, myself included, were really hoping that his sister Rukia would step up to the plate and try and avenge her brother when the Quincy invaded once again. It seemed set in stone that Rukia and Äs were eventually going to meet and clash once again, especially when Byakuya's survival was up in the air. I think a lot of people probably hoped that Renji would team up with her as well, but instead he was destined to face off against Master Masculine. But the fight between Rukia and Äs does happen, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Welcome to a brand new series on the channel, guys, Bleach Battle Analysis. Basically, I'm going to look at every battle in Bleach, the most famous and the lesser known, and analyse them much in the same way as we do the character analyses on the channel as well. As you'll see in the comments below, guys, I've left 3 Bleach fights for you to vote which one you'd like to see an analysis on next. Whichever one gets the most votes, I'll do the next Bleach Battle Analysis on. But for now, I've decided to start the series off with Rukia versus Äs, as I think it's a pretty popular fight overall. I think on the very latest Japanese Best Bout poll, it was actually voted second in the entire series, and I'm definitely not entirely sure I agree with that, but that's something we're going to get into as the video goes on. And as always, guys, before we get the ball rolling, if you haven't hit the subscribe button yet, make sure to do so, because you are in the right place for weekly Bleach content just like this video and others on the channel. Make sure to follow me and become a part of the community. I do have a Twitter page. It's actually Mr. Tomo2304 YT, just like it appears on the screen right there, and I will leave a link to that in the description below. Follow me on there, become part of the community. We also have a Discord channel, which is now over 500 members strong, so make sure to join that as well. And yeah, just keep supporting the series that we all love. So, Rukia versus Äs Nödt. This was definitely a pretty long-awaited fight. I think out of most of the Sternritter, Äs was definitely the one that left the greatest impression on us as fans from the first invasion moving forward, and people were very eager to see him fight again, yours truly included. He was my favourite Sternritter until we got to see more of Askin. So this fight begins on chapter 566 and goes all the way to 570, and it's quite a rarity within the Thousand Year Blood War to be able to say that this is a completely uninterrupted battle. From the moment these two meet to the moment one of them dies at the end, this fight goes pretty much totally smoothly and just flows uninterrupted, and I'm very appreciative of that. First of all, however, a little bit of context. Kubo clearly thought that maybe Rukia wouldn't be able to take on Äs Nödt without some kind of preparation first, so she has actually been to the Royal Palace at this point, healed up and given an exponential power boost, which has also resulted, presumably, in the completion of her Bankai. Now, we never unfortunately see any kind of specific Bankai training from Rukia, although I do think the majority of us probably assume she would have one at some point in the series. It's the natural evolution of her character, and actually when you think about it, this is something we can get more into in the specific Rukia analysis, but it's really cool how she goes from an unseated officer to a vice captain to a captain eventually. That's a really cool character growth moment, and honestly one of the biggest drivers of that growth comes from this fight. So we know that Rukia has gained a pretty significant power boost, but Äs Nödt, as far as we know anyway, is no pushover himself, so this should be a good fight. The fight starts out really strongly with Äs making a pretty creepy first impression on Rukia. You get this really cool moment where she senses his Reiatsu as though some kind of almost sinister disembodied hand has just grabbed her wrist from out of nowhere, and it really freaks her out, and it really sets the tone for Äs as a character. Kubo has a lot of fun, clearly drawing this guy up to be a real embodiment of fear. One thing that is a bit weird is Äs's personality in this fight. He is almost a completely different character from the one he was in the first invasion. In a way, that does make sense. I assume Kubo probably hadn't fully figured this guy out yet in that first invasion and just simply wanted to use him to make an impression. In the first invasion, he's very cold, calculating. He doesn't even say anything for a little while, but he doesn't seem to have any kind of sense of humour or anything like that. It's a marked difference then in the second invasion when he appears behind Rukia and is just constantly repeating things like I'm alone, and he has kind of weird jittering laughter as well. Kubo decides clearly to give him a personality that's almost like this creepy, cackling, witch-like being instead of the stoic, cold, statuesque villain that he was in the first invasion. And I don't hate this. It is quite the sharp contrast, but it doesn't really matter too much at the end of the day. It's still consistent with his whole fear motif, and it is pretty enjoyable to see. When Äs Nödt wonders where Senbon Sakura has gone, because at this point the Shinigami have regained their Bankais, Rukia is able to ascertain who he is pretty quickly, and they begin fighting. Now, as you might expect from a character like Äs, there is not a lot of physical combat in this fight. He spends the beginning part of the battle just throwing his thorns at her, and he's able to generate them apparently really quickly, and he does it in a really cool way where he brings a massive ring of them around him. At the start of the fight, Rukia doesn't really exhibit anything too out of the ordinary in terms of her power boost. She mostly dodges the thorns and then attempts to block them with Sode no Shirayuki, but Äs Nödt confirms that his fear cannot be stopped by ice, and she is afflicted by it. And I remember reading this and I couldn't believe that Rukia had been struck by a thorn as early as the first chapter. I did think it was probably going to happen at some point. I thought she would have to at least struggle with fear a little bit. But for it to be as early as this, well, that's definitely interesting. And you find out why. It turns out that Rukia has somehow figured out a way of getting around fear. And this power of hers seems almost so conveniently suited to fighting Äs Nödt that I assume she was seeking him out specifically, despite apparently not being able to recognise him just by looking at him. Those inconsistencies aside, Rukia has essentially, in the royal palace, discovered the true power of Sode no Shirayuki, and she is able to essentially freeze her body to the point of dying. It's an interesting power, if incredibly convenient, but a lot of these fights are a bit like that. But it is cool to see Rukia actually take control of a fight and be really in command of a lot of this battle. Kubo definitely wanted to give the Shinigami in general a one-up over these fights. A lot of these battles are grudge matches like the Renji versus Mask fight or the Toshiro versus Kangdo battle. This is a real chance for the Shinigami to finally one-up their Quincy invaders, and Rukia definitely does that here. She's able to beat Äs at his own game, and even turns his own words back on him when she says that perhaps someone who can't feel fear is his fear itself. The science behind Rukia's ability is probably best not thought about, and I don't really like it when Kubo tries to be scientific because sometimes it just results in it not making any sense, and I'd rather he was just a bit more fantastical with it. If he'd said something like she had just frozen her body and therefore couldn't be affected by it, then, you know, I would have bought it because it's a fantasy manga. But she tries to say something along the lines of her cells are frozen. But if Kubo's trying to apply real-world logic to this ability, then she technically shouldn't be alive. But then she's also a Shinigami anyway, so she's not alive. So the whole thing kind of becomes a bit of a mess in that regard. But regardless, it is still cool to see her with such a command over her Zanpakuto. Pretty much the entirety of chapter 567 is this back and forth between them. It's Rukia constantly shutting down Äs Nödt's fear thorns and him just being completely dumbfounded as to how she's actually achieving this. And you get some really nice facial expressions from Äs as he struggles to comprehend exactly what's going on here. One of the key things to note here as well is that as soon as Äs's fear ability is shut down, he basically can't fight anymore, and Rukia completely runs rings around him for this portion of the battle. She cuts through his shoulder. That's a really cool moment as well, when no blood comes out because she's frozen him at a certain level. And basically what's really cool is that her body is getting colder and colder as this fight goes on, and Äs is running out of time. Eventually, Rukia's body hits sub-zero, and she says that she cannot hold the position for more than just a few seconds, but it's enough. Äs Nödt literally launches himself at her. Like I said before, I don't think he knows really how to fight if his abilities aren't working, so he kind of freaks out and he just jumps at Rukia, but she's able to cleave straight through him and freeze him down to the bone. It's a pretty cool moment, and Rukia does look undeniably really badass when she turns Sode no Shirayuki over to strike through Äs. She does look really cool, and I always thought the Royal Realm outfit on her looked really cool as well. But I won't deny, as an Äs Nödt fan who'd been waiting to see him battle since the first invasion, I couldn't have been more disappointed with how this chapter went. This is a brilliant example of how the Thousand Year Blood War fights specifically are very one-sided, and then they'll flip-flop to being very one-sided the other way, and that happens in the next chapter when Äs is revealed to have somehow survived this. Don't get me wrong, I was very happy to see that he had survived. It's just a little bit strange that he is able to survive essentially being frozen to his core by a Sub-Zero ability. And all that really seems to happen is that he literally rips himself out of the ice. It's a really cool moment, I'm not going to lie. It's also kind of gruesome when you look at it properly. He is pulling himself out of the ice, and you see obviously his mask fall away as he does so. And his skin is like coming off his face as well. It's actually pretty gruesome, but he does eventually pull himself out of this frozen tomb that Rukia's put him in, and then he activates his Volsten dish. It's also here we get a little bit of Äs Nödt's motives. He basically says that the only thing he fears in life is having his existence stripped away from him by His Majesty, and that's pretty much the driving force behind everything he does. And Kubo delves a little bit more into this as the fight goes on, that really Äs Nödt is driven by his own fear as opposed to everyone else's. But regardless, you get to see Äs's transformation here, and it's without a doubt one of the best in the Sternritters. He rolls his eyes back into his head to the point where they bleed, which is pretty gnarly in general, but he also has his Quincy cross hiding on his eyeball, and then he transforms into his holy form, which is called Tartar Foras. Now, this form obviously looks ridiculously cool. Definitely got some Segunda Etapa Ulquiorra vibes in there, but like a more zombified version, if anything else. He does look really great though, and it was really cool to see a Quincy get an actual transformation. The Volsten dig until now was basically just a halo, some wings, and maybe some superfluous little other differences, but Äs had a proper transformation on the cards for us, and it looks really cool. Everything down to his constantly rolled up eyes, to his thorn wings. I loved a lot of it. He looked like a badass. Like I said though, his abilities don't really lend themselves to physical fighting too much, so not really a lot happens from this point on. Rukia attempts to swipe at him a couple of times, but she finds that she can't move anywhere. This is because her feet have been essentially paralysed to the ground by fear. We then discover that Äs's ability, which is already ridiculously powerful, has now entered the realms of being flat out broken, where as long as Rukia looks at him, she has already fallen under his spell, and that's pretty absurd. So Rukia does start experiencing the effects of the fear finally. Äs creates essentially a dome of eyes that surround her and begin to open. It is a little reminiscent of Zomari in some ways, also considering the Kuchikis are involved in this battle. But Rukia attempts to shut her eyes to shut out the fear. It's at this point that Äs reveals that that's impossible, and it's too late. Shutting her eyes will only make it worse as it plunges her into darkness. And we get to see some imagery here that, frankly, in my opinion, is just not as exciting or as interesting as what Kubo pulled out for the fear in the first invasion. In the first invasion, you see the decaying corpse of Rukia, you see the bugs climbing up Byakuya. Here you just get to see Rukia's memories, and Kubo has replaced all of the eyes with just dead black eyes, and most of the faces are turned up in like cruel grins. Now, admittedly, that is actually pretty cool, and as an idea, I do quite like it. I just think maybe more could have been done with that imagery. But Rukia is freaking out big time at this point. She is in serious trouble, and Äs himself even says that now her heart will burst and explode because of the fear that she has done so well to avoid up until this point. And we have found out that that is how Äs kills people in the past. He says something about, in the first invasion, how any Soul Reaper his thorns hit, their hearts will inflame and burst because of the fear, apparently, which is, pretty gruesome stuff. But apparently that's about to happen to Rukia, except it's not, because Byakuya arrives. Byakuya's arrival was the subject of a lot of scrutiny back in the day. I remember when this chapter came out weekly. This was now 569 where Byakuya appears, and he basically destroys Äs's veil of eyes. And a lot of people were very unhappy about the fact that this was supposed to be Rukia's big battle, her big moment to shine, and yet Byakuya had arrived potentially to steal the spotlight or even steal the kill off of Rukia. Now, I never thought that was going to happen. I admit to being a little bit annoyed at the fact that Byakuya had to help her out, but I didn't think that he was ever going to be the one to kill Äs. There was no way that Kubo was going to put Rukia through this fight and not let her finish it. So Byakuya essentially arrives for some kind of moral support, and he uses his Shikai to decimate Äs's veil before Äs can land the fear on him. And we basically find out that Byakuya's Shikai is now powerful enough to look like his Bankai. We get to see a little bit more of Az's twisted obsession with Senbon Zakura, which I always thought was really cool and completely underexplored. You know, Az has this apparently connection to Senbon Zakura that none of the other Sternritters had, where he like loved this thing, and he was like, oh, you know, how I wish it were back in my possession, and he calls it his Senbon Zakura. I thought that was really cool. And you get a little glimpse of his twisted sense of humour as well, where he comments on Byakuya not being able to keep any food down after having his stomach taken out. So, again, I really liked the interactions, but Byakuya pretty much puts Az in his place when he says that Az's pretty much crushing defeat of him allowed him to reevaluate his relationship with his Zanpakuto toe and become even stronger. And Az does not take this well. This is where the fight kind of goes a little bit off the rails. If you can't tell, the fight's been pretty up and down for me in general. The choreography, for instance, is not really there. As I said, it's not really a physical battle, this one. It is more a battle of psychological wit. There is fear involved in some places, but again, it's not as interestingly done as the first invasion fight with Äs Nödt and Byakuya. And Rukia doesn't really get to do a whole lot in this battle. She doesn't use any of Sode no Shiryuki's abilities. There's no Tsukishiro, there's no Hakuren, nothing like that. But the fight itself is fine. But for all intents and purposes, it is over at this point. Äs Nödt just absolutely freaks out at the fact that Byakuya has just ever so slightly insulted him, which I didn't understand. Kubo just, I think, wanted an excuse to turn him into a big monster to finish him off. But it's again, the imagery is good, as his stomach unstitches itself and reveals a huge Äs Nödt head for some reason, and he turns into this complete eldritch abomination, and is apparently one of the few Quincy to have like a second form. Again, completely unexplained, and never delved into any further, but maybe this is his true form? Byakuya mentions something along the lines of seeing his own fear reflected on his face, and I assume this is how he actually looks in this form. He is a monster, for instance. There's even like a little Äs Nödt skin thing hanging from around his chin. The whole thing is pretty gross, and Kubo goes pretty hard on the body horror, but for Äs Nödt I think it's really fitting. But the major point here is, of course, the developing relationship between Rukia and Byakuya. For the longest time, she has sought her brother's approval. Obviously, their relationship was always a little bit frosty, but Byakuya was disappointed to find out that she was never given any kind of a seat when she first joined the Gotei 13. And then eventually you find out that Byakuya has had some hand in holding her back out of fear of her getting hurt. So this is a real big moment for Rukia. It is a chance to stand on her own 2 feet, despite Byakuya coming in for that last-minute moral support. And you know what? I actually have come to really love this moment. I think it's probably one of the coolest moments in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. And I tell you what, if they don't play Nightmare during this scene in the anime, I'm going to be upset, because that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is like the Kuchiki theme. You know, it's the one that plays when Byakuya kills Zamari and starts talking about how Rukia is his pride. It would be utterly perfect if this plays when Rukia activates her Bankai. So obviously in this moment, Byakuya says to Rukia that he believes she has become very powerful, and that fear never comes out of nothing. You know, as Az was trying to say in the first invasion, his power is raw, unconquerable fear. It is primal, it is innate, and therefore it is completely impossible to defeat it. But as we find out in this fight, that's not entirely true. Byakuya tells Rukia that really all fear comes from something, you know, and in this particular instance we are looking at Az's own fear manifested on his face. But Rukia, as Byakuya says, has nothing to fear. You know, she's powerful enough to defeat Az, and she knows it. And Byakuya knows it too. And that's all the approval she really needs. He asks her plainly, do you have anything left to fear? And she says no. And at this point, Az is like become just this huge monster at this point, and he says that he wants to fight Byakuya, essentially. He says that, you know, the end is nigh, Byakuya. And Byakuya turns around and basically says, that's true, but I am not going to be the one who finishes you off. And obviously Az considers this to be a huge mocking insult, that Byakuya doesn't want to fight him at all, and that Rukia is going to deal the killing blow. And then obviously Rukia activates her Bankai, Hakano Togame, just as Az launches his attack. Like I said already, I do love this moment. I can envision it in my head in the anime. Like I said, I think we all probably assumed that Rukia would have achieved a Bankai at this point in the series, and it's fair to say that Kubo goes all out on this thing's design. It looks fantastic. It is a thing of beauty. It's probably the coolest Rukia ever looks, and it's one of the best looking Bankai in the series. I absolutely love the transparent sword of ice. The fact that you can see through it is just so cool. And there's definitely some kind of mirroring connection here between her and Ichigo. They both seem to essentially wear their Bankais. One's obviously total blackness, the other is glistening snow whiteness, and it's just really, really cool to see, even though she's only in it for a fraction of a second. But Äs is instantly, irrefutably killed by her Bankai. It appears to be some kind of area of effect attack. It's almost like an explosion, but the way Ás's head is literally cut in half makes me think that Rukia did do some kind of swipe with her blade that probably sent some kind of icy shockwave out. But Ás is, of course, completely frozen dead. Now, compared to most Sternritter, however, he gets off pretty good in that he actually gets a flashback. And of course, when we get to his character analysis in the future, we'll go into it more. But it's really good to see that Kubo actually felt Äs was worthy of a flashback, whereas so many other Sternritters weren't so lucky. But with Äs not crumbling into dust, we get the last really nice moment between Byakuya and Rukia. He tells her, you know, that's a wonderful Bankai. It's incredibly powerful, but also incredibly dangerous, and she must release it slowly. And I love the way he holds her hand and his fingers start to freeze. It just shows that he's not afraid of being hurt by her Bankai if he's able to help her release it. And there is really good character development here at the end of this fight. I like how they've both overcome this monstrous enemy. You know, this was the guy who nearly killed Byakuya in the first invasion, and with just a bit of moral support from her brother, Rukia has overcome this terrifying opponent. And Äs is terrifying. You know, he's definitely probably the freakiest guy that Rukia fights in the series, and she overcomes him because she no longer has anything to fear in her heart, whereas Äs is the one who is totally afraid. And I did like that. I thought the fight was messy throughout. Definitely I wasn't a big fan of the whole explanation behind Rukia's true Shikai. I thought that was perhaps a little unnecessary. And like I said, the choreography is not anything crazy in this battle, but it was never really going to be. But I do think the ending, when Rukia activates her Bankai, gains that approval from Byakuya, but also stands on her own 2 feet to defeat this monster, is really, really well done, and is great character development for both her and her brother. I also really like Byakuya's line about how a sword swung out of fear can never be used to protect anyone. I think that's a really cool line, and it's very emblematic of the Soul Society in general. We know that Byakuya is a staunch, steadfast believer in Soul Society and its ways, and yeah, I think the ending of this fight is really, really nice. It's definitely one of the most moving moments in the final arc. In my opinion, it's very emotional. And it was also cool to see Äs, you know, he deserved getting something, and he actually gets a little bit of a flashback, which I thought was nice. But that's basically it for this Bleach Battle Analysis, guys. Let me know your comments below. This was the first one we've ever done on the channel, so any improvements, anything like that, I'd love to hear your feedback. That would be really, really helpful. But until next time, guys, if you haven't hit the button already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Keep pushing us towards 20k. I would really appreciate it. But yeah, that's it for the video, guys. So until then, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.